When you think of Megaten, you probably think of Kazunari Suzuki. If you're me. If you're not, you probably think of Kazuma Kaneko. On one hand, he wanted to live with Holy Ghost. On another hand, he loved disco dancing and he loved Lupin the Third. He's a man who loved fashion so much that it became integral to his designs later in his career. He's designed some of the best things, as well as some of the worst things we've seen in Megaten. So, let's talk about him. Kazuma Kaneko was born September 20th, 1964 in a sushi restaurant in downtown Tokyo, presumably the one where both his parents worked at. This is partially where he attributes his reasoning for hating sushi. His original career path was actually in animation, with him working with an art studio that helped develop animation for the Gummy Bears Disney television show, as well as Saint Seiya. But after playing Megami Tensei 1 in 1988, he decided that he wanted to join Atlus, which, funny enough, they came to him offering him a position at Atlus, which he took. This is impressive because Kaneko was never an art school student. He was completely self-taught. This played into his inferiority complex. Part of why he felt inferior is because he felt his art lacked identity. And another reason is that he felt that the art color selection was a bit of a struggle for him to understand. Kaneko describes his early work as forced and clumsy. He compares himself to a manga artist who won a newcomer prize and now has to force to grow through working on various projects. When talking about his design work for characters, he said he often liked to use shoes, shirts, and other apparel that he loved in fashion but couldn't afford to buy himself. He also says that his work often is reminiscent of his childhood interests, and that almost everything he's designed could always be drawn back to those earlier design ideas and philosophies he loved as a kid. He cited shows like Key Hunter, Eiffel Daisaku-sen, and Playgirl, which were all very reminiscent of Devil Summoner, a series that he would later attribute to being his favorite. One thing to understand about Kaneko is that in the first 5 years of his work, he was responsible for a lot of art. In that first year, Kaneko created designs for new demons, so much so that his workload demanded the title The Demon Painter. He also would create designs for characters in Digital Devil Story 2, and that was manageable, but come 1992, he had to redesign many of the demons from the Devil Story game. His design method was simple at the time. So get this, Kaneko's early work started with pixels. Isn't that kind of weird? Yes, the reason why many of the SNES Megaten games had great sprite work, especially the ones that he was involved in, is in fact due to the part that he would design the sprite work first, then the illustration. Except in the case of characters or demons that were popular and going to be reused, whether that be characters that are important, or demons that are important, that are integral to the story that you have to interact with, or demons that would then be chopped up and reused, recolored. He said that he would do the sprite first style because it would save for the memory of the game and help you work within the restrictions of color and time, because if you're working from there, then you already have the general template for how big of a sprite you can actually create without going over the character limitation or the color limitations or the memory limitations. Here's a short guide Kaneko put together explaining it. Number 1, you visualize the design in your head, look at a lot of reference material, start with the silhouette in one color and pay attention to proportions and three-dimensional aspects of the figure. Number 2, start adding decorative elements. Number 3, flesh out the coloring in small touches. Number 4, review the progress. And number 5, draw the illustration that pairs with the sprite art. This way, the art is more in line with the sprite art when done in this order. Now let's break down his guide for doing this if you're drawing the illustration first and then the sprite art. Again, he says that this is integral for designs that are going to be purposefully used and you have to encounter those demons, as well as things that will be recycled. He also says that this is not a good way to work when you have memory limitations though. Number 1, the first thing is to consider the base design and what other demons would be using this base design. For example, he uses Cerberus And this design base also gets reused for Nue and Shanhui. Number 2, set in the contrast by adding some black to the sprite. The idea is not to deviate too much from the initial concept. Number 3, start coloring. The colors probably won't match the illustration exactly. Number 4, it's done. Yes, that's a whole step. Number 5, now using that same foundation, cut off the heads and then recreate that and also remodel the body to fit the other designs. And that's all it really for this era of Kaneko art. I like to call this the sprite era or the solo era. And although that was very interesting, because he was now responsible for the sprite art, the character portraits, and now the new illustrations, Kaneko was tasked with more than he could handle, and this resulted in him seeking out help. And this is where Kaneko's art team comes into play. In 1995, Kaneko and Atlus hired more artists to help with this project. This would lead to a number of new artists being on staff. However, the only two that get any real credit is Megumi Shiraishi and Soejima Shigenori. And again, these aren't the only two, but these are the ones that he mentions by name and that get mentioned and get credit to the degree that the other helpers or assistants don't get. So at this time, again, they were transitioning to digital, and this resulted in a new learning phase for Kaneko. He had to learn how to do digital art, which he had no experience with before. This time they would actually work using mouse and keyboard, and on top of that, he would use photo bashing, or taking pre-existing photos and manipulating them into art in order to create a finished product. This is actually a fairly common practice in concept work. And I think that I explain it a lot, but I think Kaneko explains it just well enough. And this is from an interview translated by DJ from 1996. I'm the one who does the rough sketches, including the design and the color, while 3 or 4 other people from the staff help me with the finishing. So we end up with Kazuma Kaneko and the Ghostwriters. Lately, they've been doing everything, the illustrations and everything else. That's why this is the official name. Everyone in the staff is so talented, so they should make their own official debut one of these days. And this era of Kaneko art is very evident that he's getting help, and you can kind of see this. One thing that happens is that you see different signatures emerge from the art. We're no longer getting Kaz under the signature of art. Now we're getting Kazuma Kaneko, we're getting Soy, and we're getting Meg. Now, Soy is easily explained as art that is started by Kaneko, and Shigenori Soejima takes a large part in the finishing of that art. The same could be said for the Meg art. That's Megumi Shiraishi. She does a majority of the cleanup, coloring, and whatever, to the point where she is deserving of the credit on the art itself. This is not just a thing that is done legally, but it's kind of a respect thing, in my opinion, because Kaneko is saying that this person has done so much work in regards to this art piece that they deserve credit for it. And I think that that's kind of just Kaneko being a good person and actually crediting people who help him. And it's important to note that this is the digital era that's new to Kaneko, and he would do this photo bashing technique that I mentioned earlier with pictures of himself. He would actually take funny pictures of himself, and then he would use Photoshop to edit them and create dramatic photos. And a lot of these were actually used in promo materials and in magazines and guides, and I think that that's kind of funny. So it's always important to note that Kaneko taught himself a lot. It wasn't self-taught in the way that people are just lacking the skill. It was self-taught in the way that he actually taught himself the techniques that he needed in order to do his job correctly. So a good example of this photo bashing technique that I've been talking about is seen in this Metatron and Belial fight scene. If you look at the clouds, it's very clearly demonstrated through these images that he actually took the clouds from a different photo and he photoshopped them into the background and to the foreground to create a layer of depth. And I think that it's done pretty expertly, because I didn't actually think it was a realistic photo until I saw the how he did it portion of the interview I saw. And I also think that this workflow in general is pretty interesting because it gives us something to kind of understand why art got this huge jump from 1995 to 1996 and so on. Because even after that, once we hit to the mid 2000s, there's another art jump, and there's a reason for that as well. I did want to kind of give a perspective from one of the artists that contributed to Kaneko's art team. I did want to provide perspective from someone else who was in Kaneko's art team, so here's a snippet from Soejima from his first art book. I was part of the digital coloring team that colored the demons for Soul Hackers. I had wanted to be part of this experience ever since I joined Atlus, so I was delighted to receive this assignment. It had been decided early on that the demons would be cel shaded, but Atlus did not have any tablets at the time. It was hard enough to color using a mouse, but one of the demons I had been assigned was Metatron, and that involved a lot of shiny metallic surfaces. I determined that it would be far easier to give Metatron a more photorealistic finish using an airbrush tool in Photoshop. I did an example, which was quickly approved, and since then we have colored all of the demons with airbrush tools. I think that art book in particular is interesting. The Kaneko works, I believe 4 and 5, which have the Devil Summoner 1 art, and Kaneko works 5 and 6, because you can see quite clearly that there's a disparity between the different arts. Some demons are colored slightly different, and it's hard to really understand if you don't know a lot about art, but you can kind of see which ones are Soejima, which ones are Shiraishi, and which ones are Kaneko doing the coloring. And again, this is all due to the amount of work Kaneko was given. There has to be some sort of efficiency for game design, and adding other artists to help finish work is just one of those things. So by Soul Hackers, Soejima was already designing some minor character portraits that you would see in the game. The whole art department became a system of Kaneko starting pieces, watching the process, providing color palettes, and making final decisions regarding whether or not they meet the quality. And this was not an easy process according to Soejima. Soejima and Shiraishi would go on to have bigger roles in the company, whereas Shiraishi stayed to be the colorist and then would supervise demons and character designs as 3D models. Soejima would become the art director, and he would also work to become the head of what we would now consider Hoshino Persona, our new Persona. And there's also someone I neglected to mention who was also hired early on, and that's Masayuki Doi. Doi joined the company in 1997. His first project was Persona 2 Innocent Sin, and this is where he was actually kind of like a sub-assistant to Soejima, who did the portraits for Persona 2 Innocent Sin. What Doi would do is he would color the portraits that Soejima would produce. He also designed the tarot cards for the Persona 2 duology. By the early 2000s, the team had made much of the iconic art that we attribute to Kaneko, and this was made in collaboration with Megumi Shiraishi. There was a bond between Kaneko, Soejima, Shiraishi, and more so Shiraishi and Kaneko. Between the two, there was a love of classical art and high fashion. Kaneko took Shiraishi to a fashion show for inspiration, and this flowed into things such as the Persona 2 personas, the clothes and posing of the characters in the PS2 era, and the makeup and aesthetic for the faces of characters. And this is really where Kaneko and Shiraishi became a duo, because after that, Kaneko and Shiraishi worked exclusively together. All the art that Kaneko finished for promotion was colored and finished by Shiraishi with his assistance or his guidance. In summation, this research has taught me a lot about Kaneko's creative process and the constraints of deadlines and production. Initially, I used to be somewhat of a detractor of Kaneko after realizing that the reason why there was different signatures was in fact that he had assistants. But then once I started to think about the context of this and reading the way he felt while he was developing these games, he had a lot of responsibility, and he also had a bit of an ego problem. Whereas some people would have a big ego, he had a deflated ego, and it played into his insecurity. And I think that he understood his work enough, and he understood himself enough to know that in order to meet deadlines and actually do his job well, he had to have help. It's important to note that he was a very competent artist nonetheless, and that's why I understand that my initial reaction was misguided. There's also something to be said about his statements regarding why he withdrew from being the premier designer for Atlus, and he simply says quite often that he wanted to give the younger generation a spotlight. He was actually even asked to do the art for Persona 3, and he said the same thing, that he wanted to give Soejima some spotlight. And if he didn't do that, we wouldn't have the amazing art that Soejima would grow to do. So thanks to all the good vibes that you guys have been sending my way via Twitter, Twitch, or in the comments of these videos, I really do appreciate it. And if you choose to subscribe because of this video, thank you. But you should follow me on those Twitters and Twitches, because I am quite an excellent gamer, great voice actor, great artist, very humble, not to mention that I post some of the best tweets on the Twitters. P.S. Please stop comparing me to Mike Tyson. My celebrity doppelganger is Jordan Peele. Okay? PPS, please don't use this video to be like, where's Kaneko? Where did he go? Because I addressed that in my next video that will be coming out shortly. All that being said, I hope you guys learned something new about how the art was done, who it's supposed to be attributed to, and why Kaneko is the greatest person who's ever lived, and why sushi is actually bad. Subscribe to this channel for more videos. Thank you for watching, and goodbye, Mega Tennis fellow.